There are moments in life where you realize no matter what you do, someone is going to get hurt. That's exactly where I found myself, stuck between the truth and the risk of ruining a friendship. I never expected to be in this position, and I certainly didn't plan for things to blow up the way they did. But sometimes, the past has a way of catching up with you in the worst possible way. It all started a couple of years ago. I was at a party with some friends, one of those loud, chaotic nights where the music is blasting, drinks are flowing, and everyone is just enjoying the moment. It was one of those nights where you feel weightless, free from responsibilities, just living in the moment. At some point, in between taking shots and laughing at something ridiculous, I started talking to a guy. His name was Jake. Jake wasn't the kind of guy who immediately stood out in a crowd, but he had this effortless confidence about him. He was funny in that charming, easygoing way, the kind of guy who knew exactly what to say to keep a conversation going. We talked for what felt like hours, flirting in that casual, meaningless way that comes naturally when you're both a little tipsy and neither of you is overthinking anything. One thing led to another, and before I knew it, we were hooking up. It wasn't some earth-shattering, romantic moment. It was just that, a random hookup. No deep conversations, no lingering feelings. Just two people caught in the moment, enjoying the kind of fleeting connection that doesn't really mean anything once the night is over. And when it was over, that was it. We didn't exchange numbers. We didn't follow each other on social media. We didn't even say we'd keep in touch. It was just one of those things that happens and then fades into the background of your life. Or at least, that's what I thought. Fast forward a year later, and I became friends with Rachel. We met through work, and from the start, we just clicked. She was the kind of person who could light up a room, loud, funny, always the life of the party. We got close fast, bonding over late-night drinks, venting about annoying coworkers, and sharing stories about dating disasters. She was the kind of friend I had been missing in my life, someone who felt like a true sister. Then, she started seeing someone. From the very first time she mentioned him, I could tell she was already falling hard. She wouldn't stop talking about how amazing he was, how he was the most honest and genuine guy she'd ever met. She was convinced he was different from every other guy she had dated. Every time we talked, she had some new story about how sweet he was, how he did little things that made her feel special and loved. I was genuinely happy for her. She deserved someone great. And then, one day, she finally asked if I wanted to meet him. I didn't think twice about it. I showed up to the dinner, excited to finally meet the guy who had made my friends so happy. But when I walked in and saw who was sitting next to her, smiling like he belonged there, my stomach dropped. It was Jake. At first, my brain refused to process what I was seeing. It was like one of those surreal, out-of-body moments where everything slows down and your thoughts scramble to make sense of what's happening. For a second, I genuinely believed it had to be a different guy with the same name. That maybe I was just overreacting, my mind playing tricks on me. But then his eyes met mine. And in that split second, I knew. He recognized me too. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Here was this guy, sitting next to my best friend, acting like a completely different person than the one I had met that night years ago. There was no flicker of surprise on his face, no awkward acknowledgement, nothing. Just a completely blank expression, like he had already made up his mind to pretend I didn't exist. Rachel had no idea. She was completely oblivious to the silent tension that had just filled the room. She was still smiling, still glowing with happiness, still looking at Jake like he was the best thing that had ever happened to her. And meanwhile, I was sitting there, feeling like my past had just slammed headfirst into my present. I felt trapped. On one hand, what happened between Jake and me was so long ago, before she and I had ever even met. It wasn't like he had cheated on her, or like I had done something wrong. But at the same time, it felt like a secret now. A secret that neither of us had been expecting but were now forced to keep. And suddenly, I wasn't sure what to do. For the rest of the dinner, I felt like I was stuck in some kind of twisted social experiment. My body was physically present, but my mind was racing, spinning in 100 different directions. Every time Rachel spoke about how perfect Jake was, how she had never felt so secure in a relationship, how she was so lucky to have found someone like him, I felt something tighten in my chest. Jake, on the other hand, was calm. Too calm. He never slipped up, never made eye contact with me for too long, never showed even the smallest crack in his carefully constructed facade. It was like he had already decided that whatever happened between us didn't exist, and that I should do the same. I told myself over and over that this wasn't a big deal. That I had no obligation to say anything. That what happened between Jake and me was years ago, that it didn't matter, that it had nothing to do with Rachel. But the more I tried to convince myself, the worse I felt. Because it did matter. Not because I still had feelings for him, not even close, but because I could already see how this would play out. At some point, the truth would come out. Maybe not from me, but from someone else, somewhere down the line. And when it did, Rachel wouldn't just feel betrayed by Jake, she would feel betrayed by me. That thought sat like a stone in my stomach. By the time the dinner ended, I had made up my mind. I wasn't going to tell her that night, I needed to think, to figure out the best way to handle this. But I also knew I couldn't just bury it forever. A few days passed, and I barely heard from Jake. He didn't reach out, didn't text me, didn't try to get ahead of the situation. It was like he was just waiting to see if I would keep my mouth shut. Meanwhile, Rachel kept raving about how amazing he was, completely unaware that every time she said his name, my stomach twisted. Then, one night, we were at her apartment, having one of our usual wine nights. We were sitting on the couch, laughing, scrolling through our phones, when she suddenly turned to me with the biggest smile. "I think he's the one." My breath caught in my throat. She looked so happy, so sure. She told me how Jake had been talking about the future, how he was different from all the guys who had hurt her before, how she felt like, for the first time, she was with someone she could really trust. And in that moment, I realized I couldn't keep this to myself. Not because I wanted to ruin her happiness. Not because I wanted to make things weird. But because if I didn't tell her, I was lying by omission. And I knew that when she eventually found out, from someone else, or in some unexpected way, it would be so much worse. So I took a deep breath, braced myself for the worst, and said it. "Rachel. I need to tell you something." The moment I told Rachel the truth, I could feel the air in the room shift. Her entire body stiffened, the warmth in her face draining as she processed what I had just said. There was no immediate explosion, no dramatic shouting, just silence. A heavy, suffocating silence that felt more painful than if she had just started screaming. She sat there, staring at me, and I could see the wheels turning in her head. At first, she looked confused, like her brain was struggling to fit this new information into the reality she had built. Then, slowly, that confusion twisted into something else, disbelief, disappointment, and, worst of all, betrayal. I tried to explain, stumbling over my words as I told her that what happened with Jake had been meaningless, a random moment from a different time in my life. I told her that I hadn't even recognized him at first, that I had debated telling her but didn't want to ruin things for her. But as the words left my mouth, I realized how hollow they sounded. None of it mattered. To her, it wasn't about Jake, it was about me. She set her glass down with more force than necessary, her face unreadable. Her posture had shifted, rigid now, as though she was physically distancing herself from me even though we were in the same room. She didn't ask for more details, didn't demand to know how it had happened or why I hadn't said anything sooner. Instead, she just let the weight of the situation settle between us, creating an invisible barrier that hadn't been there before. Eventually, she stood up, movements slow and deliberate. There was no yelling, no accusations, just a quiet, restrained hurt that somehow felt so much worse. Without another word, she left the room, leaving me sitting there with the realization that I had just fractured something that might never be fixed. The next day, she didn't text me. Or the next. Days turned into weeks, and the silence between us remained. I debated reaching out, crafting apology messages that I never sent, hovering over my phone with the desperate hope that she would make the first move. But she never did. Jake, of course, stayed quiet. I wasn't surprised. He was smart. He knew that staying silent, letting Rachel focus her anger on me instead of him, was his best option. He had nothing to lose. I was the one left sitting in the wreckage, realizing that no matter what I had done, the outcome would have been the same. If I had told her earlier, would it have changed anything? If I had kept it to myself, would she have found out anyway? There was no winning. Now, weeks later, I still don't know if I made the right choice. Maybe I should have said something from the beginning. Maybe I shouldn't have said anything at all. Maybe, in the end, it didn't even matter, because the damage was done, and Rachel was gone. So, AITA for telling her the truth? Or was this one of those situations where the past should have just stayed buried? Story number 2. AITA for taking my sister's husband's side in their divorce because she cheated? Loyalty is supposed to come naturally within a family. That's what I always believed, at least. But now, standing in the middle of a disaster that my own sister created, I've come to realize that sometimes, family loyalty isn't about who shares your blood, it's about who actually deserves it. My sister, Natalie, 34F, and her husband, Ryan, 36M, had been married for almost 10 years. From the outside, they seemed like the perfect couple, 2 kids, a beautiful home, steady jobs. Ryan wasn't just my sister's husband. Over the years, he had become like an older brother to me. He was the kind of guy who always showed up, whether it was helping me move, giving me career advice, or simply being the kind of steady, reliable person I wished more people were. If you asked me a year ago, I would have said that Natalie and Ryan had one of the strongest marriages I knew. But clearly, I didn't know everything. A few months ago, Ryan called me out of the blue. His voice was completely different from the usual calm, laid-back tone I was used to. He sounded hollow, drained. He didn't dance around it. He just came right out and said, "Natalie's been cheating on me." I felt like the floor had dropped out from under me. My sister? The same woman who had spent years talking about how marriage was about trust and commitment? The same person who would roll her eyes at people who couldn't stay faithful? It didn't make sense. At first, I thought there had to be some mistake. Maybe Ryan was overreacting, maybe there was a miscommunication. But then he told me everything, the texts, the sneaking around, the late nights that she had brushed off as work events. And worst of all, she had been cheating for over a year. Not just some drunken mistake, not some brief lapse in judgment. A full-blown affair. I barely knew what to say. I told him I needed to talk to Natalie first. Maybe there was some part of this I wasn't seeing, some explanation that would make this make sense. But when I confronted her, expecting denial, maybe even guilt, I got neither. What I got was indifference. When I confronted Natalie, I expected some kind of reaction, denial, guilt, even anger. Anything that would show she at least understood the gravity of what she had done. But instead, I was met with something worse, indifference. She barely even tried to justify it. She just shrugged and told me that things weren't working between her and Ryan, that she had been feeling trapped in the routine of marriage and that meeting someone new had made her realize what she had been missing. There was no apology, no remorse, just an apathetic acceptance that she had destroyed her own marriage. I sat there, stunned, as she casually admitted to sneaking around behind Ryan's back for over a year. She talked about it like it was nothing more than an unfortunate situation, like she was discussing a job she had outgrown rather than the father of her children, the man who had built a life with her. When I asked her if she had even thought about how this would affect Ryan, or their kids, she rolled her eyes. She told me that Ryan would get over it and that the kids would be better off with two happy parents rather than one unhappy marriage. Her complete lack of guilt made my blood boil. I had always thought of my sister as a strong, responsible person, someone who took her commitment seriously. But now, I was seeing someone else entirely, someone selfish, entitled, and completely unwilling to take responsibility for her own actions. I didn't know what to do with that realization. But I knew one thing: I couldn't support her in this. When Ryan filed for divorce, I took his side. I didn't do it to be petty, I didn't do it to punish Natalie, I did it because he was the one who had been wronged. He was the one who had built his life around a marriage that turned out to be a lie. He was the one who had tried. And if Natalie wasn't even going to have the decency to feel guilty about breaking that, then she didn't deserve to be surrounded by people blindly defending her. That decision tore my family apart. My parents, of course, immediately sided with Natalie. To them, it didn't matter what she had done, she was their daughter, and that was all there was to it. My mom called me disloyal for not standing by her, and my dad told me I was choosing an outsider over my own blood. They kept insisting that marriages are complicated, that I shouldn't judge Natalie for one mistake. But this wasn't one mistake. This was a year of lying. A year of sneaking around. A year of making Ryan feel like he was the problem while she was out building a whole other life behind his back. The more my family pressured me to forgive and move on, the more I realized that they weren't actually upset about what Natalie had done, they were upset that I wasn't willing to pretend it didn't happen. And I refused to play along. Now, months later, my relationship with my family is barely hanging on. They've made it clear that as long as I continue to have Ryan's back, I'm the problem. I still talk to Ryan, I still check in on him, on the kids, because I know he doesn't deserve to be abandoned just because Natalie happens to be related to me. But my parents? My sister? They see me as the traitor now. So, AITA for standing by the person who was actually wronged? Or should I have just kept my mouth shut and supported my sister, no matter what she did?